Well, thank you, Olivia. Hi, so for those of you that don't know me, I'm Lee Panglia. I'm the head of CIPD for Scotland and Northern Ireland. So a warm welcome to this CIPD Scotland event, which is exploring the idea of a 4-day working week and with this work for Scotland. Unlike how most people in HR understand a 4-day working week, to many others, it's about doing one less day's work for the same pay, so not 4 long days. The idea isn't new, but it's been brought to the forefront of both policymakers and practitioners in recent times, as you'll have heard Charlotte and Ian discussing a little bit there before we started, really as a result of the pandemic. And there's a lot of discussion around both within our communities as HR practitioners, L&D and OD practitioners, but also across wider policy stakeholders of this. And in fact, this event came about today through one of our senior members, Jacqueline, who's on the call today, on the webinar today, suggesting that it would be a really good topic for us to discuss at both a policy and a practice level. I think today with Charlotte and Ian, and I'll introduce them in a minute, we're very much focusing it from a policy perspective, but I think there's lots of discussions that we can have at a later date as practitioners around the people and development and particularly OD implications of any policy changes that may come in. So the idea is not new, as I said. We've seen in recent times work patterns changing dramatically as a result of COVID, and many believe that now is the right time to look at exploring the 4-day working week further. So it's all about that building back better out of a crisis, and in recent and over a long period of time, historically, changes to working patterns has been a way of responding to economic crises. So from a policy perspective, we've seen New Zealand's Prime Minister raise the possibility of introducing a shortened working week. We've seen UK politicians, cross-party MPs calling on government to set up a commission to consider the proposal. And then looking at Scotland, we've seen Scottish Government announce in May there will be a new post-COVID-19 Futures Commission, which will explore the potential of a 4-day working week. And then, as you will have heard Ian and Charlotte chat about the move to a more flexible working environment, which we've seen in recent times, the kind of move towards a 4-day working week is kind of taking it that next step further. So I'll stop waffling because we've got a lot to get through today. So from a practical perspective, everyone's been placed on mute. If you can use the chat function to post any observations or ask any questions as you go through, and we'll have some time at the end to answer those questions, or as many of them as possible, as best as we can. And the session is being recorded. So we have 2 speakers today. We're going to start off with Ian Brinkely, who is a former CIPD chief economist. Prior to working at CIPD, Ian's worked at the Work Foundation, the TUC, the Centre for Environmental Studies, and also in academia. Ian now works as an independent labour market economist and still works very closely with us at the CIPD. And then Ian will then pass over to Charlotte Lockhart, who is the Chief Exec of 4-Day Week Global. I'm sure Charlotte will tell you more about her organisation, which is fascinating. But essentially, she works to promote internationally the challenges and opportunities associated with a 4-day week. Based in New Zealand, is that fair to say, Charlotte, but currently sitting in Surrey. Both of them will spend 10 to 15 minutes giving their views, and then we'll open it out to questions at the end. So without further ado, if I can introduce Ian, please.
Well, thanks very much. I'm going to be resolutely big picture on this, so I'm hoping I don't confuse you with doing my presentation. I mean, two things to say right at the start. First of all, trying to reduce the working week, there are lots of good economic and social reasons why you would want to go down that path. So I don't think there's any disagreement in principle about the worthiness of this objective. Secondly, there isn't a great neon sign in the labour market saying, no, you can't go any further in terms of reducing the working week. We've now got used to a working week for full-time workers of just over 40 hours a week. That's not immutable, it can be changed. Historically, it has been changed. So where we are at the moment is we roughly have a workforce that splits 60, 30, 10. And the 60% are people who are pretty happy with their hours. They don't want any more, they don't want any less. You've got about 30% who say they want a cut in hours, and you've got just over 10% who would like more hours. And those preferences don't seem to have really changed very much over the last 20 years. There's a lot of consistency in that. Of the 30%, most of those, about 2/3, say they want a cut in hours, but they won't accept a cut in pay to do it. And the rest say we'd like fewer hours and we will accept a pay cut. So we're talking about quite substantial numbers here in the UK of employees who would like fewer hours, even if we don't really have enough evidence to say exactly how many fewer hours they would like, but there's a substantial minority of the workforce who would like fewer hours. Internationally, as ever, it depends which measure you take. If you look at the average across all workers, we're roughly in line with the European Union average. If you take full-time workers, we're at the top end. Now, those differences aren't huge. They're about 2 hours a week between the UK and the European Union for full-time workers. So it's certainly not mission impossible to think about at least moving UK into alignment with the rest of the EU average. And it doesn't seem to me there's any strong economic arguments about going down that route. I mean, it seems to me that's perfectly achievable over time. So what's been happening over time? Well, the answer is almost nothing. If you look at most industrialized economies over the last 20 years, the average working week has barely shifted. You get one or two where there's been a bit of movement. Essentially, the working week has remained more or less where it is for that long 20-year period, and that's been true for a diverse range of economies, all the way from the United States across to the Nordic economies and ourselves as well. So there's a very sort of general picture there of nothing much changing. I don't think we really know why. My own favourite explanation is that the economic headwinds against cutting working time have got worse. And that's because over the past 20 years, we've moved from a position where we had pretty strong economic growth and strong productivity growth accompanying it. We're now in a world, and we have been for at least the last decade, where economic growth is very weak and productivity growth overall has been much weaker than it was historically. And so I just think that makes things much more difficult to actually translate economic progress into fewer working hours. It may also be that preferences have shifted. We know that lots of people want to reduce working hours. We don't really know how strongly they feel about it. And it's just possible that people, given all the other pressures on households, are giving a higher preference to maximising things like wages and less strength to reducing hours. But I think that's more speculation than something we can point hard evidence to. So what can we do about it? Well, I think we think about those areas where we've probably got the scope for most progress. Let's take the group that say we'd like fewer hours and we're willing to take a cut of pay. This ought to be the easiest to accommodate. And although it's only about 11% of the workforce, that's still 3 million people. That's not a trivial number. And so the question I would ask is, well, why aren't we doing better at trying to give people what they want if they're willing to bear the cost themselves? The second area, which is I think the one which is perhaps where you're going to get most leverage, is thinking about it in terms of the bargain. And in much of continental Europe, we have the mechanisms which are very strongly in place through collective bargaining. So typically in these countries, 80 to 90% of the workforce are covered by collective agreements. In the UK, it's a much, much lower figure. And for many years in the past, trade unions, particularly in places like Germany, have been very good at part of the annual bargaining round to either trade off pay or non-pay against reductions in hours. And that's one of the reasons why Germany has been, over time, been able to reduce its annual hours fairly successfully. We have examples in the UK of this. The CWU, for example, has just completed an agreement with the Post Office, which cuts their working week. But it's part of a wider bargain around automation, around changes in working practices. But this idea of introducing working hours as much more part of the annual bargaining round seems to be where we don't seem to have a lot of traction at the moment. And I think that's something we need to really think about how you can get the discussion about hours into those sort of mechanisms. Now, we've looked at this in terms of government policy, and there actually is something which the CIPD has played a very leading role in, called the Flexible Working Task Force, set up under the May government, and has survived the change in UK government. I'm not sure that's looked particularly deeply at the whole question of the 4-day week or substantial reductions of working time, but it seems to me that's a mechanism we already have, where CIPD has an important input. In fact, Peter Cheese, who's the CEO of CIPD, is actually leading it. But it seems to me that's a ready-made body which can start looking at, well, what are the mechanisms and how would you actually get this this movement further forward than it has been up to now. There's the sort of radical option, which I suspect we'll hear a bit more of, is, can you jump to a 4-day week straight away in one go? And the sort of most important argument around here is that cuts in working time can actually generate extra productivity, which make that sort of radical shift entirely feasible. There's nothing in economic theory says that's not possible. That there are good reasons why it might be, and there are some examples. But I would say overall the evidence base is not particularly strong at the moment. I think it's more a case of not proven on a big scale rather than saying it won't work. And part of the reason is because we don't have good measures of productivity at the workplace level. So firms typically don't measure productivity in a way which economists would understand. And economists measure productivity in ways which most business people don't understand either. But it's also quite hard to try and extract out the impact of the working time cut from all the other changes you're likely to have to make in order to accommodate that. So we're still not quite clear about the cause and effect. Do the big changes in the business allow you to cut working time, or does cuts in working time actually drive the productivity gains in a much more positive way? The last area which I'm probably least keen on is legislation. Now we have some examples of legislation around. We regulate some occupations, such as transport and so on, for safety reasons. And we have the Working Time Directive, which was successful in actually cutting out some of the extreme long-hour jobs in the UK economy. But we don't have that many examples of successful implementation through legislation. And the example which I think has scared people off is France, which tried to legislate for a 35-hour week, and is probably a good example of how not to do it. It was a horribly complicated piece of legislation. It had almost no effect on the French average working week, and it seems to be what's happened is that lots of French workers kept their hours where they were. Some may even increase them because they were now being paid at overtime rates rather than basic rates. So it made French labour a bit more expensive, it made French industry a bit less competitive, had no effect on the average working week. So if you're looking for examples of how not to do it, then the French example is probably the best one we have there. And I think it has made governments around the world sort of more sceptical about whether the legislation in this area can actually work. So those are some of the main points. I think at the moment what we're trying to do is finding a credible set of mechanisms and areas where policy can positively help to try and move this forward, because over the past 20 years we've been stuck. And if we want to move in a new direction, you've got to come up with something incredible, I think, to try and shift the labour market over time towards shorter working. My own view, it's probably one of the most challenging things we've got at the moment, particularly in the short term, where I think the bigger concerns, understandably, are going to be focused on people either without work or people who don't have enough hours, simply because of the immediate effects of the crisis. But incremental improvements over time, I can't see any reason why, if we were coming back in, say, 30 or 40 years' time, we look back and said, a 40-hour week, really? Was that the best we could do in the modern economy? So that's my sort of opening remarks, and I'll hand over to be sort of denounced or supported as you see fit.
Okay, so I guess that's me. Hi everybody, Charlotte Lockhart, I'm CEO of 4 Day Week Global. Lots of really great points in what Ian has said, and I agree, Ian, I agree with pretty much everything that you have said. So I just want to explain a little bit about who I am and where we fit in with the picture. So we ended up in the whole 4 Day Week journey because Andrew Barnes, my partner, we have a company in New Zealand called Perpetual Guardian, and you have probably heard of our very successful implementation of the 4 Day Week into our business. And that was over 2.5 years ago now, and in November we will have been doing it for 3 years. And so what we are looking at when we talk about the 4 Day Week and what we're doing is it started as a conversation about productivity. And this is one of the issues that Ian was talking about in his thing. So we started on this journey because Andrew read a magazine article that referred to some research that said that the productivity in the UK was less than 2.5 hours a day. There's been subsequent research that puts it more closer to 3, but it's still not 8 hours or a full working day. And Andrew started to think about whether that was the case in our business, and even how would we know if that was the case in our business. And if we could fix that, could we give the staff more time off? So we didn't come from the shorter work, we want to have a shorter working week. We came from how can we improve productivity and therefore have a shorter working week. And so what we did within our business is we ran a trial. So we announced to the staff that we'd like to do this, and we gave them a month to prepare, and we ran a trial to see how we could create, and at that time it was a 4 Day week. We didn't close the offices for any days. And people had to choose days off that fitted in with the business imperatives. The rest is, as they say, is history. We now run a reduced hours work week model, not just a 4 Day week model, but at its heart, it's a conversation about productivity. So I think that it does pay to look back in time in terms of how we did end up on this whole 4 Day week malarkey, or 5 Day week malarkey in the first instance. And over, through history, we have wound down the number of days and the amount of time that we've worked. So we've gone from working 7 days to 6 days down to 5. And we've kind of then just ended up resting on 5. But when you think about it, when we went to the effectively 40-hour work week, our society was constructed quite differently. And that 40 hours of paid employment in a family generally meant dad. It was one person in a family being paid for 40 hours of work. Not always, but that was quite, where our, how our society was constructed in a norm at that time. We've rolled forward to now, and both parents are working, and our society is constructed quite differently. We, in the UK particularly, commuting for an hour and a half, 2 hours to get to work is not uncommon. And so therefore, when you look at what is work now in a family and in our society, it's so much more. We have our smartphones, that is work. My phone is always with me. It's my alarm clock and my camera. So when I go on holiday, I can clear my emails too. And so our ability to switch off, I think, is one of the things that we are really quite desperate for as we move forward. And I think this is really at the heart of why reduced hours working is starting to become something that is more of a focus. And obviously post-COVID, we've had all of the experiments that that have come out of that. So if we accept that work has got itself into the wrong proportions within our lives, then how do we find mechanisms to actually rebalance that? So it's really important to understand that our economy, and particularly post-COVID, with the recession we're going to go through and all of the challenges that we are likely to face as we rebuild our economy, we have to be very mindful of the fact that productivity and profitability for companies needs to remain high so that we can keep our economy going and we can keep paying taxes. Because obviously, as a kind and generous community that we are, we have determined that having a tax take of a certain standard allows us to be an economy and a society of a certain standard. And so when you focus in on what is the productivity requirement for a company to remain profitable, and then spin off the well-being aspect for their staff of being able to work less hours, then that feeds back into the productivity. So when we look at what's happening in the UK, the 4-day week is actually being run by hundreds of companies throughout the UK. The UK probably has the biggest adoption around the world, and that includes the very large economy of the US. The UK and Ireland have the biggest number of companies that are doing the 4-day week, and they're doing that separate from policy, they're doing it separate from politics. They have decided that this is the way that they want to run their businesses forward. And most of them, the vast majority of them, will never go back to anything else because it has improved their productivity, it has improved their profitability, and it has made their places a far more enjoyable place to work, not just for the employees, but also for the owners and managers. And that was actually one of the side effects that came out of it. Running a 4-day week trial and running the 4-day week in our business was the best team building exercise that we ever did. So I think the argument is now no longer should we move to reduced hours, but actually what are the mechanisms by which we could be doing it. I, like Ian, do not think it should be legislated. I would struggle to see it legislated. The France example is classic for that. Because when you legislate for a reduced hour work week, you're not solving the problem around the productivity. But what I would like to see legislators do is look to encourage businesses to go down something like this. And there are all sorts of mechanisms that they can use for that. So for example, in the UK, you have to report your gender statistics when you do your annual reports. Well, why not have in your environmental, your other diversity, your mental health for your staff, all the aspects that a reduced hours work week, which are all great things for us to have in our society. If companies had to measure those sort of things, they would be looking at ways to have better statistics as far as that sort of thing is concerned. So that's maybe something that the politicians could look at. The other sort of things that are in Germany, they have something called the Zugearbeit, where they created a program by where businesses were able to reduce the hours of their workers and reduce the pay. So it's an economic benefit. But the government came in and provided funding support for employees for that 5th day, and those people needed to be on targeted programs that gave them the ability to increase training and develop themselves in that time. So therefore what we're doing is with this time that we have, we are then looking to create a better self and a better economy. So there are a number of things that can be put in place that would help and support businesses to become reduced hour workplaces without necessarily mandating them to be there. How quickly can we get down that journey? And Ian has made some interesting points on that. When Henry Ford brought in the 5-day work week in his business, it took him 3 years in just one business. quite a large business, obviously, and a business that was very diverse in terms of the type of people that he was employing. But he was committed to the idea, and he rolled it out division by division, and over time he became a 5-day workplace. So you don't necessarily have to feel the pressure to get it done straight away and to just jump on board and be done. I think that there is a program for us to go through. There is a process. We in the 4-day week world recommend that you do it through a trial, and there's all sorts of mechanisms, and we're not really going to talk about the tactics today. But the strategy around how we do it and the policies that we want to be putting in place need to look at what is the society that we want to have moving forward. And if we agree that we want better than what we have now, then we need to look at how we change that. And those of you who are in the HR world, you'll know that the millennials and the young ones, she says, middle-aged bossy older sister person here, the young ones don't want to work in the same way as we did. And they've seen the baby boomers and the Gen Xers, they've watched us burn out. They are a generations that have been brought up in care because both parents have been working. And they want a different society. They want to work for companies that value them, that value what they achieve. They also want to work for companies that value other things outside of profit. And so if we accept that that's the journey that they're on, they are our future workforce. They are the people who are also our future leaders. And so if we don't change the workforce for them, they will change it for themselves, and we'll be left on the shelf. So as a kind and generous society that we want to be part of, we need to look at how we create a workforce and a workplace that reflects that generosity. So I'm about out of time. I'm happy to be taking questions. And if any of you want some help with tactics and want some help with that, you feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, or go to our 4-day week website. We're 4dayweek.com. There's all sorts of advice. There's our white paper that's there. There's all sorts of stuff that's there that can help you with some of that. And certainly I'm happy to come online with you at any time and help you with some of the questions that you might need to use to talk to your C-suite and talk to your board.
Thank you, Charlotte, and thank you, Ian. I think that's all been really interesting, actually, and learned a lot that I didn't know before. We've got a lot of questions coming in, so Lee and I will field these together, hopefully. I'll just kick off with one, actually, that both of you have kind of covered, but I think it's an interesting question to pose anyway. So Abby's asking about the legislative perspective. So both of you kind of said that you're not too keen on the legislative perspective, and there is some problems with that. And actually that's interesting when we're talking about Scotland, because the Scottish Government don't have the devolved powers to actually implement this in Scotland. Employment law is not devolved, although they can promote it and they can look into it. They can't actually legislate for it, I suppose. So I suppose the question is, how important do you think kind of political backing is then, I suppose? Do you think politicians coming out in favour of the 4-day week could play a role? Abby's saying it's not really something that can be a grassroots movement. I suppose workers can't just say, I'm just going to work 4 days now and decide for themselves, but it's something that businesses need to take on. But do you think there's a place for politicians to come out and support, and do you think that has an impact? Ian, do you want to take that on first, maybe?
Yeah, so I'm a little cynical about politicians trying to give messages to how business runs itself. They don't always have the greatest credibility in that area. But you know, if you look around the institutions in Scotland, you've got some quite strong institutions there which are talking about work, the future of work, whether work can be made better and fairer, so on. They involve a lot of stakeholders. I mean, it seems to me you've got all the institutional mechanisms there, probably in a way which we don't have in England, or at least to a greater extent. And I think bringing those bodies together and trying to see whether you can come up with, maybe it's a sort of ACAS style set of advice or guidance, but something that gives it a sort of an official push without having politicians standing up at Holyrood and using it for what people will see for political advantage. So I think you want to depoliticise it, but give it official standing, if you see what I mean. And I think that will probably have the biggest credibility with most organisations.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the issues in the UK with the 4-day week, of course, was that Jeremy Corbyn decided it was a really good idea, which immediately politicises it. And if he says that it's a good idea, then the right immediately has to say, well, it's a bad idea. But this is a business idea, you know. So it's actually it is completely apolitical. So as I say, it's good if politicians understand that actually working the number of hours that we are working now isn't good for the society that they're trying to lead. And so for them to create an environment where they encourage business to it. But there are, as I say, hundreds of companies in the UK and Scotland that are doing it anyway. They don't need politicians to get in the way. But one of the things I always say, you know, when I'm speaking is that the problem with legislating it for it is my 4-day week doesn't look like your 4-day week. So having a one-size-fits-all is what happened in France, and then it didn't work because the individual businesses have individual needs, and the individual staff members have individual needs. And while there's lots of similarities, how an organisation comes to, if you do, as I do, talk to businesses that are doing a 4-day week around the world, there are so many iterations of how they do a reduced hours, whether it be 4 days or 32 hours or whatever. There are just so many different iterations in terms of how they engage with it and their customer base and all those sort of things. Those solutions need to remain fluid so that businesses can continue to be productive.
Thank you, both of you. I think that's really interesting. I think probably for a lot of employees, they think legislation is the be all and end all and it would force them, but I think what you're both saying is companies need the tools and the guidance to implement it and to see the benefits of it rather than being mandated to do so. I
think one of the other points, Olivia, that you made was that this isn't something that the workers can lead. This is absolutely something the workers should lead.
Yeah, I think what Abby was just meaning was you can't just tell your boss you're not coming to work that day because you've decided. But no, I think you're right. No, you can speak up.
Yeah, but you know, but get together with all of your friends at work and put together a case. If you walk into your employer and you can say, I'm going to give you a program that will increase our productivity by a minimum of 20%, your boss is going to listen. They only think you're mad because you say, because I want to go home on Fridays. So it's, you know, but if it was a software or some sort of McKinsey program or something like that, bosses would be right on board with it. It's just counterintuitive that me going home on a Friday or finishing work at 3 o'clock actually will give you a better business. But so that's, you know, so from an employee perspective, you just need to build the business case. And by running a trial, you make it very safe for your boss because you go, well, let's just try it. It doesn't work. We can give it up, and then just back yourselves to make it work.
Well, for everyone who's watching and listening, there's your way. Yeah.
No.
Lee, do you want to come in, or do you want me to carry
on?
I know we can't really hear you, Olivia. So there's a couple. I'm going to try and kind of combine a couple of questions, if that's okay. So we have Linda's asking, is the 4-day week over 7 days or are there extended weekends? Does this put a supply and demand of businesses to have staff over weekends? And then maybe if we can combine that with a question around from Emma, who's saying, introducing this different working week pattern, did you experience any challenges, individual, team or with clients? So Charlotte, would you maybe start with that?
So we are a company with 250 staff across 16 branches throughout New Zealand, and our branches are open retail hours. And so we said to our staff, customer service can't go down. We're not closing branches. We're not shutting up shop at any time. And so what happens when you hand that problem over to your staff, they find the solutions to create the customer service experience and not have a gap with that. A lot of other organisations also, and I think this is a great idea. One organisation in the UK gave me the idea first, and I recommend it all the time. Is every Friday or every Thursday afternoon, he sent out an email to his clients. They are an organisation that closes on Fridays, but he sent this out. He reminded the clients that this is what they were doing, and he invited them to provide him with feedback every week around what was happening and how the experience was for them, so that they could so that they could feel free to have that. And they learned from that and made adjustments along the way. He said that he got feedback for the first 2 or 3 weeks, and then after that hasn't had any feedback since, because sometimes you changing your business model is a case of educating your client in terms of what the new thing is. And if they understand why you're doing this and how important it is to you, they generally come on board. That, of course, is not so effective as a mechanism in something like a petrol station or a business that is a hotel, which is open 24/7 and has to have staff on 24/7. So if you're going to reduce staff hours, you're going to need more staff. In some organisations, there's just no getting away from that. But the reality is that if your staff are doing a better job when they're there and they are more productive, doesn't matter how many staff you have, if every single one of your staff members is actually being more productive, that means more money. But what you need to look at is, well, what are the things that start to affect it? Now, so one of the great examples is a care home in the United States who decided to bring this in as a model for their nursing and care staff. And they made the US job market's a little bit different. They made it a requirement that if you didn't call in sick, you could have this particular program. But of course, what happens in those environments is often the staff are quite low wage, and you're competing with other things that happen in their lives where they might be able to get more money, or then they're not necessarily feeling as engaged with your job as they might be if they get the offer to work some overtime somewhere else on a weekend or something like that. And so then when they call in sick at 8 o'clock in the morning and you have to call in the agency nurse to cover that person, that costs you 1.5 to 2 times what it would cost you if that person had just turned up. And so what this care home found is that when they offered this reduced hour work model to their staff members, they had less people calling in sick. They had less people creating problems for them, but they were also providing a better quality of care. So therefore there was less work to be done because problems were being picked up with patients sooner than if they than they were before, because their staff were better rested, they're better engaged. When you look at the likes of Gap, they brought in an app where staff could change their and adjust their schedules and the shifts that they were working on. And when they did that, their productivity and their sales went up by 10%. Because people were engaged with work at a time when they wanted to be there. There's nothing worse than having somebody on the shop floor who just doesn't want to be there. And we've all done it, right? We've all been into a shop. I mean, Andrew and I tell a story. Andrew and I were shopping for a specific pair of jeans that he was looking in, and we were in a specific department store in Sydney, and they sell this brand of jeans. We couldn't find it. There were 3 people chatting in the menswear department. We grabbed one of them, explained what we were looking for, and were given that, oh, well, they're over there kind of answer. And we walked out without buying a thing. And so therefore you've got disengaged people on the shop floor. Why are you paying them? They're not selling anything. They were just clearly, they were busy with whatever conversation they had on. And I'm not saying it wasn't a work conversation, but their job is to be there to sell stuff to the people who come into the store. And so what businesses need to understand is that, you know, how you find a reduced hour work model is actually how you get your staff to engage with why that would happen. That was the long answer.
Thank you. Lots of different. What's fascinating is to hear examples across different industry sectors, and to see how it can work. And I guess things to be aware of. And my goodness, have we got a lot of questions? So I'll do my best to get through some of them.
While you're reviewing those questions, Lee, there isn't an industry that isn't doing a reduced hour work model. So if you say that'll never work in law, that'll never work in schools, that'll never work in care homes, that'll never work in manufacturing, I'm sorry, you're just wrong.
Okay, so that leads me so nicely onto a question from Abby that says, how do you see this working in education, or are we only talking business? Abby works in further education, which is part of a bigger structure with collective bargaining.
Yeah. So again, it comes down to how do you make it work at your workplace? So don't worry about the entire industry, just worry about your workplace. The key way to make it work is to ask your people. We want to work less hours in this business, but we need to have the same outcomes from what we do. How will you adjust what you do and your teams to be able to make that happen? The classic story I tell with this is not education, but it's law, and law's always going, oh, it'll never work in law. You know, and I had this lovely young man tell me that it would never work in law, and I asked him how many people were in his law firm, 350 over 3 offices, it would seem, all of them with qualifications, it would seem. And so I said to him, you know what, so you're all very clever people, so you're telling me that if you all got together and sat in a room and said, we want to work less hours, you couldn't work out together as a collective how to make that happen. So the collective is really important. You will find all sorts of things. Generally, what the answer to the question is, what am I not going to do? Not what am I going to do? Businesses, when they go down this road, or any organisation when they go down this road, they really, at the heart, look at why are they really there? What are the outcomes we're looking at? And what is everything else that we do that actually isn't a part of that outcome?
Thank you for that. There is, you mentioned law there. There's a question from Leslie Dieger. How would you suggest this as a way forward for companies whose business model is built on billable hours?
Yep.
So lawyers, consultants, engineering company, yep, where
absolutely,
productivity is typically measured and profit driven by what percentage of their working hours can be billed?
Yes, so they're basically just billing for time. So this is how a law firm bills their clients, and feel free to correct me, any lawyers on the line, but this is what happens. They do their 6-minute blocks, and at the end of the month, it's all brought together in terms of a billable hour count. The managing partner has a bit of a look at it and then bills the client what they think they will tolerate. Clients are not often billed for every single 6-minute block. So therefore, they're already just billing based upon what they think the client will pay, what they value the client, they think the value the client will have got from it. And then the question to ask yourself with that is my 6-minute block at 9 o'clock in the morning, at the advice you're giving me in that time, as valuable as the 6-minute block at 9 o'clock at night? And what tends to happen in billable hour, billable moment things is that the work that needs to be done is often done outside of office hours because so much other stuff is done during office hours. And so those environments tend to have very long hours because there's so much else that fits itself in. And when you go through a process of deciding actually what is the important thing for the outcome, a lot of fluff gets pushed aside. If you also bear in mind, depending on the industry you're in, clients hate being charged by hour. I have no idea whether you've achieved what you're supposed to achieve until such time as you've got to the end of the project. actually shifting over to a value-based pricing model where you're saying to your clients that this is the piece of work, this is how valuable it is, this is what I'm going to charge you, and leave the hours to me to resolve, is actually a far more honest and far more value-based way of engaging with your clients. Most clients don't like lawyers because they don't know that every time they pick up the phone with that one little split-second piece of advice, they're going to be charged a 6-minute block. Having something a bit more upfront, I think, is so much more comfortable for the client.
Can you hear me now?
You're quite low.
I'll just need to shout. Can you hear me better now? I'll just start shouting. There was a question that I'm just trying to find. Oh, so Ian, you were talking about how it's quite difficult to measure productivity in a way that both businesses and economists can understand at the same time. Rosie is saying that she works in the civil service and she suspects that in her organisation it would be quite difficult to measure productivity. So I suppose a question for both of you. Ian, what do you think the best way to measure productivity would be? And then Charlotte, for you, how did you, there's a questions about how did you measure productivity in your organisation when you were doing your trial? So Ian, I don't know if you want to come in first, and then maybe Charlotte can come in.
Okay, I mean measuring productivity is one of the biggest challenges we've got, and it's really difficult in the public sector. It's difficult enough in the private sector. It's almost impossible in the public sector because we really don't have good measures of what productivity would look like in the public sector. Most business organisations don't think of productivity in the way that economists would. Economists would think in terms of greater efficiency. So that's how much each person is producing for the same effort. And if you're able to produce more for the same effort, that's productivity. If you're just working harder, that's not productivity. That's just you putting in more hours or just working harder during the day. Now, most businesses don't measure how much their workers produce in the economist terms. They tend to do things like measuring sales. They measure something else, but they don't measure that. And one question that CIPD has experimented with was asked them, well, how well do you think you're doing compared to someone like you in the same industry? Trying to get a relative measure. And it's like asking car drivers, are you a good driver or not? Everyone says they are. And suddenly, every time you ask employers, are you doing better than your competitors or worse, they almost always say they're doing better, which of course is an arithmetic impossibility. The closest we've got to good measures in the public sector, I think, is with the NHS. And that's when we had enough data to be actually measuring things like patient satisfaction. We could measure the rate of reinfections in hospitals. We could measure waiting times. For a lot of other public services, we just don't have that data in the same way. But that NHS model of measurement, which was developed by the Office for National Statistics, is actually a bit of a world beater. Not many other people have gone down that route. And if we could roll that out over other parts of the public sector, at least we'd have some good evidence on which to base whether productivity is going up or down, rather than the incredibly crude measures we use at the moment.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, well, look, in reality, business doesn't care how economists measure productivity. Business should be caring about how it measures its own productivity. But remember, so this was at the heart of why we went down this journey in the first place. We wanted to know what productivity looked like in our business, and we had some jobs. We have lawyers in our business who charge on billable hours, so that's why I feel I'm able to talk about it. But also in that space, we had a whole pile of job roles that we didn't really understand how to measure their productivity, and that was the challenge that we sent to our staff, and we got them to sit in their teams and actually understand what is our team's purpose. Why are we here? What do we do in the organisation that means that our cog lets other cogs be successful? And by working out what the team's reason for existing and what its productivity should look like within that whole, means that you can then filter out the individuals from that. So each individual job role obviously feeds into the team's job role purpose, and then the team's purpose feeds into the whole company productivity. So actually breaking it down and actually looking at it as a community around how we measure productivity. There are all sorts of productivity tools that you can use. There's Sapiens, there's Microsoft Analytics, there's a whole pile of software you could put in place. If you wanted to go that way, you can start measuring some of that. Please do measure it with complete openness with your people. Don't start putting stuff in and then not telling people what you're measuring. And also, there's no real need to be measuring stuff at a very granular level in our experience. But some CFOs, some CEOs, some organisations do want that. But at its heart, you're looking at, why am I at work? You've got a job. You're employed to do something. Actually, what is it that you are employed to do? And what are the steps and what are the things that you do that mean that your job is done? And that's what you're looking at. What happens when you go down this process with your staff and you say to them, how will we measure your productivity? In general, human nature will mean that people will say that they're entirely more productive than they really are, which of course is, you have to be very careful with, because if you're going to measure them on this as part of a productivity measurement thing, you're letting them set themselves up for disaster, because when they say they're more productive than they really are, and then they don't achieve that over the long term, then they're not going to, they're not going to succeed at what they're doing. So it's about an open and frank conversation at an individual team level, and then that team level goes up to its management, and that management goes up to the C-suite. And so you take the line from the worker level back up, and that's how you find productivity for your business or your industry or your company, your organisation. That's why my 4-day week doesn't look like your 4-day week.
Thank you, both of you. I think that was really interesting to hear it from both of your perspectives. We've only got 5 minutes left, so Lee, I don't know if you want to come in with one more question, but there's quite a few questions in the chat asking specifically about, Charlotte, your trial and how people can implement this. So you said at the start people can connect with you, so I'm just going to advise people to go to Charlotte's website and seek advice from there, because we're not going to get through all the questions today.
No, and they can, and if you want to send me the questions, Olivia, I will then just put together a document and answer them all, that you can circulate that as well if you like.
Perfect. So I'll pose those questions to Charlotte after this, and when I'm sending out an email after the event, I can send her little document on to you. So thanks very much.
And I'm happy to do a separate event just on tactics if people want.
Perfect. All very helpful. Thank you very much, Charlotte. Lee, I don't know if you've got a final question that you've picked up.
I've got a question that Leslie's posed that's related to productivity. Leslie de Jager again. There seems to be conflicting advice on productivity. You seem to be saying that you can work harder, more intensely over 4 days, taking fewer breaks, and have the 5th day off. But lots of other advice out there says that people can only maintain high concentration in short bursts and require regular breaks throughout the day to refresh. So I don't know if either of you want to comment on Leslie's point there.
Well, sorry, Ian, to jump in again. Look, if productivity is less than 3 hours a day, you only have to get an extra 45 minutes of productivity into your day, and you are on a 4-day week. So actually, reality is, it's not about not taking breaks. We do definitely need to take breaks, but it's also about how we work. And some of that tactics stuff, I'm really happy to talk through that in terms of how you do that and how you achieve that in the day. So that, because last thing you want is for this to burn out your staff as well. And so there are very easy ways in which you can create this. And I'm happy to take that offline.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you're increasing work intensification, in order to compensate for the reduction in hours, then your project has failed. It hasn't achieved what you're trying to do, which is get a better work-life balance. So if you're spending 4 days in the office incredibly stressed because the performance targets are just unrealistic to make up for the fact you've lost a day, then all you've done is shift the problem somewhere else. You haven't actually solved the basic problem of addressing work-life balance. So it is a real challenge, and so that's why you need some rather good measurements of what's happening both before and after, so you don't fall into the trap of just increasing work intensification, essentially making individuals pay for the shift in the to lower hours rather than the organisation as a whole.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, well listen, thank you both. As Olivia said, we're not going to get through all of our questions today, so apologise for those of you that we've not had a chance to answer your questions live, but Charlotte has kindly offered, and I'm sure Ian, if we have other questions that perhaps I'm sure you could input into if we're able to take those.
Oh yeah, just let them on to me and I'll do my best to try and answer them.
No, thank you. And I think, as Charlotte said, there are so many. I think the next stage in this discussion, because we can't stop here, can we? We've only started to uncover some of the areas that clearly our members want to understand a wee bit more. Is that kind of tactical, that understanding how it works in real life, and there's some questions that we haven't got to around, what are the lessons learned from yourself, but also organisations across different industry sectors that are going through this. And a couple of comments in the chat box are from people that are starting to embark on their own pilot and have some specific questions about this. So that'd be great to kind of pick up those.
Yeah.
And I think that from an HR practitioner, from a people and development, OD, L&D point of view, I think that there's so many other areas that we can explore over time. So it just remains for me to thank both Charlotte and Ian for your great contributions, very varied contribution, and for everyone that's posted questions and observations. And I look forward to how the discussion progresses, and I just would like to thank you, and I'll end it there because I think it's always good to try and finish on time. So we're only 1 minute over, so thank you everyone, and we'll follow up with other information. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.